What would you do if your new neighbor started acting like your backyard pool was a community property, and even tried to take it over? That's exactly what happened to me last summer, and let me tell you, it was as infuriating as it was unbelievable. My name is Sophia, and I've lived in Willow Creek, Oregon, for 5 years. It's a quiet suburban neighborhood, perfect for someone like me who works remotely and values peace and privacy. My house is my sanctuary, and the crown jewel is my backyard pool, a space I spent years dreaming of and finally made a reality in the summer of 2020. For me, it wasn't just a luxury, it was a personal achievement, a retreat after long, stressful workdays. Everything in Willow Creek had been serene until November 2021, when my new neighbor Karen moved in next door. Karen, a single mom with 2 kids, Ethan, 15, and Chloe, 10, seemed friendly enough at first. I introduced myself when she moved in, even offering help if she needed it. But Karen wasn't exactly neighborly. She barely acknowledged me, which I brushed off at the time as a sign of someone adjusting to a new place. Months passed, and things were quiet, until June 2022, when I opened my pool for the summer. The Oregon heat was relentless, and I was ready to enjoy my backyard oasis. Little did I know, Karen had other plans. The first encounter came on a Saturday afternoon. As I was lounging by the pool, I heard a sharp voice calling over the fence, "Hey, you." I looked up, startled. It was Karen, her face set in a tight, disapproving scowl. What she said next would set the stage for one of the most absurd battles of my life. Karen stood at the edge of the fence, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of annoyance and entitlement. "A pool like that shouldn't just be for one person," she declared, her voice carrying over the fence. "Imagine how much joy it could bring to the neighborhood kids." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Her tone was casual, almost conversational, but the implication behind her words was clear. I smiled politely, trying to keep things friendly. "I understand where you're coming from, Karen, but this is my private pool. It's not really set up for community use." Her smile vanished in an instant, replaced by a look of exaggerated disbelief. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "The previous owners always let us use it. My kids swam here all the time before you moved in." Her statement was so blatantly false that it took me a second to process. The Thompsons, the previous owners, didn't even have a pool. I had the thing built myself 2 years ago, a project that drained my savings but was worth every penny. Still, I didn't want to escalate things. "I'm sorry, but that's not accurate. The pool wasn't here when the Thompsons lived next door. I had it installed after I moved in." Karen's eyes narrowed, her face reddening slightly. "Well, that doesn't change the fact that it's selfish to keep something like this all to yourself. My kids have been looking forward to swimming this summer. You really can't expect us to drive all the way to the park when there's a perfectly good pool right next door." I took a deep breath, determined to keep my composure. "I understand it's inconvenient, but this is my property. I have to be cautious about who uses the pool, it's a liability issue. There's a great public pool at Rosewood Park, and I'm sure your kids would have a blast there." Karen scoffed, throwing her hands up. "Liability issues? That's just an excuse. Nobody's going to sue you. You're just being selfish." Her tone was growing sharper, and I could feel my patience wearing thin. I stood my ground, keeping my voice firm but calm. "I'm sorry, Karen, but my answer is no. This is my pool, and I decide who uses it." She glared at me for a moment, her jaw tightening. "Fine," she spat. "If that's how you want to play it, I'll just take this up with the HOA." The threat would have been laughable if not for her intensity. Willow Creek didn't even have a homeowner association, but Karen clearly thought she could intimidate me with her empty words. Without waiting for a response, she stormed off, muttering something under her breath. I watched her go, a pit forming in my stomach. I had a sinking feeling this wasn't the end of it, and I was right. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. At first, I hoped Karen would cool down after our initial conversation. Maybe she just needed time to realize I wasn't trying to be difficult. But as the days passed, it became clear that Karen wasn't the type to let things slide. If anything, she seemed more determined to make her point, and make my life miserable. It started subtly, almost laughably so. One morning, I found a note in my mailbox. Written in large, looping handwriting, it read, "Stop hoarding community amenities. Learn to share." I rolled my eyes, crumpled it up, and threw it away. I wasn't about to let an anonymous passive-aggressive note get under my skin, even though I had a pretty good idea who had written it. But the notes kept coming. Sometimes they were left in my mailbox, other times tucked under a rock on my front porch. One even appeared taped to the side of my pool gate, boldly declaring, "This is selfish behavior. Think of the children." Each note was more absurd than the last, but they all carried the same theme: Karen wasn't backing down. Things escalated further when Karen started sending her kids, Ethan and Chloe, to my house. They'd knock on my door, their faces a mix of awkwardness and discomfort, and ask, "Can we use the pool today?" The first few times, I gently explained that it wasn't possible, hoping they'd pass the message along to their mom. But their visits became more frequent, and more insistent. I couldn't help but feel bad for the kids. It was clear they were only doing what their mom had told them to, and they looked embarrassed every time I said no. Karen herself wasn't any better. Every time I used my pool, I'd catch her watching me from her kitchen window, her arms crossed and her face locked in a scowl. If our eyes met, she wouldn't even bother to look away. It was unnerving, like she was trying to intimidate me into giving in. The final straw came during a small gathering I hosted for a few friends. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, and we were enjoying some grilled food and cold drinks by the pool. Everything was going great until we heard Karen's voice, loud and angry, cutting through the relaxed atmosphere. "How dare you have a pool party and not invite us?" she yelled from her side of the fence. My friends exchanged incredulous looks as I walked over, trying to keep my composure. "Karen," I said, keeping my tone firm but polite, "this is a private gathering. I'm not obligated to invite you or your family." Her face turned beet red as she pointed an accusatory finger at me. "This is discrimination," she shrieked. "You're deliberately excluding us. I'm calling the police." I stood there in stunned silence as she stormed back into her house. "Don't worry about it," my friend Tom said, trying to lighten the mood. "She's bluffing. No one's going to call the cops over a pool party." But Tom was wrong. Less than an hour later, the sound of sirens shattered the peace. Karen had made good on her threat, and the police were now pulling up to my driveway. This feud had officially spiraled out of control. I thought Karen calling the cops on my pool party was the peak of her absurdity. I was wrong. That was just the warm-up. Over the next few weeks, her behavior grew even bolder, crossing lines I never imagined a neighbor would dare to cross. It started one particularly hot afternoon in late July. I came home from running errands, looking forward to a quiet swim to unwind. As I pulled into my driveway, something seemed off. I could hear faint splashing and laughter coming from my backyard. My stomach tightened with a mix of disbelief and anger. I parked my car and quickly walked around to the back of the house. What I saw left me speechless. Karen and her 2 kids were in my pool. Ethan and Chloe were splashing around while Karen lounged on one of my patio chairs, a smug smile on her face as if she owned the place. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached, trying to stay calm despite the surge of anger bubbling up. "Karen," I called out, my voice sharp but steady, "what do you think you're doing?" Karen didn't even flinch. Instead, she looked up at me with that same infuriatingly smug expression. "Oh, hey, Sophia," she said casually, as if we were old friends catching up. It's so hot today, and the kids really needed to cool off. I figured you wouldn't mind. I stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. Of course I mind. This is my property. You can't just come into my backyard and use my pool without permission. Karen's smile faded, replaced by an indignant scowl. Don't be so dramatic, she snapped, standing up and crossing her arms. This pool belongs to the neighborhood. You can't just hog it all to yourself. We have as much right to use it as you do. I could feel my blood pressure rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. Karen, we've been over this. This is my pool, on my private property. I had it installed 2 years ago. You have no right to be here without my permission. I'm asking you to leave now. Her face turned an alarming shade of red. This isn't over, Sophia, she hissed, ushering Ethan and Chloe out of the pool. You think you can keep us out? We'll see about that. I thought that would be the end of it for the day, but I should have known better. Less than an hour later, Karen was back, this time with the police in tow. She had actually called them, claiming that I was trespassing on her pool. The audacity was staggering. When the officers arrived, I took a deep breath and calmly explained the situation, showing them my deed and the security camera footage of Karen breaking into my yard. The lead officer, Officer Harris, reviewed the evidence and gave me a sympathetic nod. Ma'am, he said to Karen, this is clearly private property. You have no right to access this pool without the owner's permission. Karen, however, wasn't ready to back down. That's not true, she argued, her voice rising. The previous owners always let us use it. It's practically part of the neighborhood. Officer Harris raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, we've checked the property records. The pool was installed by Sophia after she purchased the house. You have no claim here. Karen's face crumpled as her argument fell apart. For a moment, I thought she might finally admit defeat, but instead, she doubled down. This isn't fair, she yelled. She's hoarding resources while my kids suffer in this heat. She's just as selfish. Ma'am, Officer Harris interrupted firmly, if you continue to harass or trespass on this property, you could face legal consequences. Do you understand? Karen glared at me, her face a mixture of anger and humiliation, before finally storming off with her kids. As the officers left, Officer Harris turned to me and said, if she gives you any more trouble, don't hesitate to call us. I nodded, thanking him, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this wasn't over. Karen had crossed a line, and I had a feeling she wasn't done trying to push it further. For a brief moment, I thought the police intervention would put an end to Karen's antics. She had been caught red-handed trespassing, her arguments debunked, and the law was firmly on my side. But instead of backing off, Karen seemed more determined than ever. Her behavior took a strange turn, not just entitled, but oddly calculated. A few days after the incident, I started noticing small but peculiar things. Karen wasn't just glaring at me from her window anymore, she seemed to be studying me. I caught her taking photos of my pool from her backyard, and one morning, I even saw her speaking animatedly to another neighbor while pointing in my direction. It was unsettling. What was she planning? The answer came when I ran into Martha Green, an older neighbor who had lived in Willow Creek for decades. Martha had always been friendly and talkative, the kind of person who knew everyone's business. I heard about the police being called, she said, her voice tinged with concern. That Karen has been stirring up quite the fuss. I sighed, reluctant to discuss it further, but Martha leaned in conspiratorially. You know, she continued, Karen's not new to this sort of thing. I've heard stories about her from her old neighborhood in Portland. That caught my attention. What kind of stories? I asked, my curiosity piqued. Martha lowered her voice. Apparently, she got into a big dispute over a shared garden space. She claimed it was her right to use it whenever she wanted, but it turned out she didn't even live in the complex long enough to have a claim. She even tried to sue one of the residents, but the case was thrown out. The pieces started falling into place. Karen wasn't just entitled, she had a history of pushing boundaries and making false claims. But why? What was driving her behavior? It wasn't until another neighbor, Lisa Carter, shared more details that the picture became clearer. "Karen's struggling," Lisa said. "Her divorce left her in a tough spot financially, and I think she's just trying to provide for her kids. But she has this way of twisting things. She's always looking for an edge." It was then I realized Karen's actions weren't purely about entitlement. They stemmed from a deeper place, an overwhelming sense of insecurity and fear. Her fixation on my pool wasn't just about the heat or her kids having fun. It was about control, about feeling like she could claim something that wasn't hers to compensate for what she'd lost. I couldn't condone her behavior, but for the first time, I understood it. Karen wasn't just the neighborhood villain, she was a person grappling with her own failures and projecting them onto me. It didn't make her actions right, but it gave me a new perspective, and it made me question how I wanted to handle what came next. I realized I was facing more than just a legal dispute. This wasn't about a pool anymore, it was about how to deal with someone who was fighting a battle far beyond what I could see. The question now was, could this feud be resolved, or was it destined to escalate further? I expected Karen to dig in her heels after the police intervention, but what happened next left me stunned. About a week later, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Karen standing there, holding Chloe's hand. For a moment, I braced myself for another confrontation, but her expression wasn't one of defiance. It was of exhaustion, and, surprisingly, remorse. "Sophia," she began, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, "I need to apologize." I blinked, unsure if I had heard her correctly. "Karen? Apologizing?" "I've been acting out," she continued, avoiding my eyes. "I thought I was doing what was best for my kids, but the truth is, I was letting my frustration and jealousy get the better of me. It's just, things haven't been easy since the divorce. Seeing you with the pool, the house, everything, it brought out the worst in me." Her words took me by surprise. This was the first time Karen had shown any vulnerability, and it caught me off guard. For all the frustration and anger she had caused me, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy. "I appreciate your honesty," I said cautiously. "But you have to understand, your actions put me in a difficult position. You crossed boundaries that shouldn't have been crossed." She nodded, looking genuinely ashamed. "I know. That's why I'm here. I want to make things right. Chloe and Ethan told me they'd talk to you, and it made me realize how much I've been teaching them the wrong things. I'm sorry, Sophia. Truly." I sighed, feeling the weight of the weeks-long feud begin to lift. "Thank you for apologizing, Karen. I'm willing to move forward, but there need to be boundaries." "Absolutely," she said quickly. "And if it's okay, I'd like to contribute to the pool's maintenance costs if you'll let the kids use it sometimes, only under your supervision, of course." It wasn't the resolution I had expected, but it felt fair. I agreed, and we hashed out clear rules. The kids could come swim a couple of times a week, only when I was home, and Karen signed a liability waiver to cover all bases. What surprised me even more was what came next. "I've been thinking," Karen said, hesitating. "Maybe we could work together on something bigger. A community pool at Rosewood Park. That way, all the kids in the neighborhood can have a place to swim, and no one has to feel left out." Her suggestion was sincere, and it felt like an olive branch. I agreed to help her, and together, we started a fundraising campaign. To my surprise, many neighbors supported the idea, and Karen threw herself into the project with unexpected enthusiasm. It was as if she was trying to make amends not just with me but with the entire neighborhood. By the end of the summer, the campaign was well underway, and Karen and I had found a tentative but peaceful coexistence. She was far from perfect, but she was trying. And for me, that was enough. Looking back, I realized the conflict with Karen wasn't just about a pool. It was about boundaries, empathy, and the challenges of navigating life's hardships. Sometimes, the people who act the worst are the ones struggling the most. While it doesn't excuse their behavior, it opens the door for understanding, and maybe even resolution. As I watched Chloe and Ethan laughing in the pool one sunny afternoon, I felt a surprising sense of peace. The pool, which had once been a source of tension, had become a bridge between us. And that, I realized, was the real victory. As the weeks turned into months, things between Karen and me settled into an uneasy but peaceful rhythm. The kids came over to swim under the agreed-upon rules, Karen stayed within her boundaries, and the neighborhood buzzed with excitement over the prospect of the community pool at Rosewood Park. It felt like the chapter of tension and conflict was finally closing. But just as I began to let my guard down, something happened that caught me completely off guard. One crisp autumn morning, I stepped outside to check my mailbox and noticed an envelope with my name scrawled across the front in Karen's handwriting. Inside was a handwritten letter. At first, I assumed it was another apology, perhaps her way of tying up loose ends. But as I read the letter, my heart raced. Karen wasn't just apologizing, she was leaving. The letter explained everything. Her sudden move to Willow Creek, the entitlement over the pool, the strange, obsessive behavior, it all stemmed from something much deeper than I had imagined. Karen had been fleeing a toxic relationship back in Portland, one that had left her emotionally and financially devastated. When she moved to Willow Creek, she hoped to start fresh, but seeing the stability and success of others, like me, brought all her insecurities to the surface. In the letter, Karen admitted that her actions weren't just about her kids wanting to swim. They were about trying to reclaim a sense of control in her life, to feel like she had something to offer her children when everything else seemed out of reach. "You didn't just stand up to me," she wrote. "You showed me that boundaries can be healthy and that it's okay to start over the right way. For that, I'll always be grateful." The final twist came at the bottom of the letter. Karen revealed that she had been secretly working with the city council to secure funding for the community pool and had already finalized the approval process. The groundbreaking ceremony was set for the following month, and she hoped I'd attend. "I want you to see how much you've inspired me to do better," she wrote. "This isn't just about the pool, it's about giving back in a way I should have from the beginning." I stared at the letter, my emotions a jumble of surprise, sadness, and even pride. Karen and her kids moved out 2 weeks later, leaving behind a quiet, heartfelt goodbye. I hadn't expected her to leave so abruptly, but in a way, it felt like the right conclusion to our story. She wasn't running away this time, she was taking the lessons she'd learned and applying them to a fresh start somewhere else. On the day of the groundbreaking ceremony at Rosewood Park, I stood among the crowd of neighbors, watching as the first shovel broke ground for the community pool. The air buzzed with excitement, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. What had started as a battle over property had transformed into something much bigger, a reminder of the power of boundaries, second chances, and the possibility of change. What would you have done if you were in Sophia's shoes? Would you have forgiven Karen?